I'm Kate Benson-Fuller. I'm an associate professor and extension specialist in the Department of Ag Econ and Econ at MSU. And I'm going to be talking about the Montana ag situation and outlook today, July 29th, 2022. All of the stuff that I'm talking about is subject to change, and in part because of that, and in part because I want you to be able to come up with your own situation and outlook. I'll really try to focus on the sources of data and analysis that I'm using for this report. So if I had to sum up the last year in Montana agriculture in 1 minute, there are three things I'd probably want to bring up. The first is the historic drought that we saw last year in 2021 that we're still dealing with the implications from this year in 2022, as well as part of the state, particularly parts of the state that were not as impacted last year, are seeing a lot more severe drought this year. A more recent development is the Russian war on Ukraine, and in particular, how that's affected grain markets. And then lastly, the big overarching trend is inflation. So really steep increases in price for both prices received and prices paid by agricultural producers across the US. So focusing in on the drought again, this is a map put together by the folks at FarmDoc, which comes out of the University of Illinois and is a great resource for up-to-date ag econ info. We're looking here at loss ratios by county. Higher loss ratios mean higher crop insurance claims, which mean higher losses. So more severe drought generally in our area. And you can see that Montana and Montana counties really stick out here. This state received some of the worst of the drought that happened last year. Prices, the good part of prices, I guess, is that output prices, we've seen upward trends for over the last couple years. So here we're looking at Montana's two main commodities, wheat and calves. You can see both have increased. Wheat much more than calves, which has gone up more gently. This information is from USDA Quick Stats, which is a great resource for querying agricultural statistic information. You can get there really easily by just Googling USDA Quick Stats. And it is a great wealth of information that I use all the time. So the other flip side to prices received going up, or output prices, is the input prices have, of course, also gone up really substantially. And so this breaks down a version of the graph that I showed on one of the first slides into livestock and crop markets. The story is largely similar. Both prices paid, prices received have gone up a lot. For livestock, it really looks like prices spiked in late 2021, early 2022. And I'll say that if you're a cattle producer here in Montana looking at that and thinking that that's not right for what you've experienced in your in the prices that you've got for your calves, I'll just highlight that this is the all livestock number, and it does include other livestock markets outside of cattle. So I'm going to break this up into crops and then livestock. So first, focusing on crops. In terms of production, we don't yet have numbers for 2022, so I'm still looking at 2021 here. And 2021 was a very, very bad year for crop production here in Montana. So wheat was at 44% of what it was in 2020. Similar story for other crops, barley, pulse crops, lentils, dry peas, and chickpeas all really need water, and they had a really very bad year. The source for this again is NASS Quick Stats. One bright spot for Montana producers is that we store a fair amount of wheat here, particularly wheat on farm. You can look at what that's looking like in the USDA grain stocks report. And for producers that had wheat available to sell, particularly wheat that hadn't declined a lot in quality after being stored for maybe several years, was that they were able to sell that wheat off at a premium. So you can see, looking back to 2017, which was another drought year, not as severe as 2021, grain stocks have increased every year since then, until 2021, where a lot got sold off. And then the last stocks report that we have is from June, so the pre-harvest report. We were down to a level that hasn't been seen in a pretty long time. The crop acreage reports just came out, and I'm always pretty interested to see how these compare from year to year. So wheat, very flat compared with the last several years, really. Hay rebounded a little bit from where it was at last year in response to the drought, but I don't think a lot of people were quite ready to fully recover hay acreage, so we're not seeing what we saw in 2020 and the years before that. Barley has inched up over 1 million acres again for the first time in a little while, and pulses seem to be in a little bit of an increasing trend since a relative low in 2020. So where are we at right now? Well, I like to check the crop progress report. It's a weekly report that comes out between April and November, and it gives some different information in different weeks, but in general, it lets us know where we're at with crops and condition. So first, pasture, which I guess is a type of crop. As of July 25th, we had the majority of pasture being rated as good or fair, which might not seem excellent, but it is a lot better than where we were at last year. Spring wheat was in the last report, and the condition of that, the bulk of spring wheat is being rated good or fair, so pretty major improvement from where we were at last year. And then, of course, a lot of this is being guided by where we're at with soil moisture and moisture in general. And so if we look at topsoil, a fair amount is being rated as adequate or short. So this isn't great. So it seems like we're moving into a drier part of the year, which is what generally happens around right now. If we look at the subsoil report, it is looking slightly worse. So it'd be great to get some rain. The Russia-Ukraine conflict, as I mentioned, is playing a big role in grain markets and really disrupting them on a global scale. Here in the US, it's played a direct role. So the graph on the left, put together by folks at FarmDoc, and you can see that in particular, wheat markets were disrupted by this conflict. So when right after Russia invaded the Ukraine, they went up substantially. So why is this? Why is what is happening in another part of the world really affecting us? Well, Russia and Ukraine are really, really major players in global wheat production, and even more major players in exports. So if we look at wheat production, the combined total of Russia and Ukraine, that's about 15% of the total world production. And Ukraine, while last season they did okay with production, this was before the invasion, but getting that grain to market has been a major issue. So looking at a massive backlog of grain, as reported in this Bloomberg piece back in April. This story is largely the same today. And looking at this from the export perspective, Ukraine, in the list of exporting countries, may look pretty small, but they're still a very major player. And their 2022-2023 export outlook is pretty far down from where it was just last year. And that's being driven by barriers to export, missile strikes, reduced planting, and then from what was planted, seeing a reduced harvest. So what does this mean in Montana? Well, just to bring what I just talked about up to date, there has been an agreement to allow Ukrainian wheat to ship that has been bartered, and that is supposed to start as soon as actually today. But it has seen some threat from Russian missile strikes. There's a lot of uncertainty there, and I have not seen yet today what is up. This will definitely improve food scarcity in the region, which is an issue. The price effects will be somewhat muted here, but these markets are really global markets. And you can see this is using price series derived from MSU extension tool. You can Google Montana ag prices. It should come up, or the URL is in this slide. But you can see some major global events. It looks like are pretty well correlated with Montana price spikes. So looking at Golden Triangle and northeastern Montana markets, we saw price spikes after the Russian invasion and price spikes after India banned wheat exports back in May. Now, these are not the only things going on for sure, but they're probably playing into what's going on. And exports are very important to US wheat. And that's particularly true for Montana. We export a lot of our wheat produced here. So here we're looking at exports, the blue bar, total production, the red bar. You can see that the blue bar is roughly 50% of the red, and that's just what that green line is showing, looking at the percentage that's exported. So we're going to move on to livestock markets next. The big theme in livestock markets has been the drought. So this is a news article from DTN last year. But this drought is really continuing to have repercussions here, and different parts of the country are experiencing it pretty severely right now in 2022 as well. So last year, Montana's cattle inventory dropped quite a bit. It dropped about 10%, which was the most out of any state. Across the US calf crop is down about 1%, and the US cattle inventory is down about 2%. This is the third year of reduced inventory, and I'll say that drought is a pretty major driver here. This information is from the USDA ERS Livestock Outlook, which comes out every month and is an excellent resource on kind of what is going on in both domestic and international livestock markets. And just to note, where does Montana fit in this graph? Well, we're relatively small at 2.45 million head of cattle. You can see on the y-axis, we're at over 100 million total in the US. So what's happening here? Well, high feed prices are pushing down margins for feeding cattle, so a little bit less incentive to feed cattle, pushing down on demand for calves from Montana and other cow-calf states. This is a graph just looking at animal feed prices and their changes from the 5-year average price. And you can see that for 2021, and really in particular for corn, especially in 2022, we've seen big changes. And In part because of that, because of those lower margins, we're seeing higher cattle slaughter. So cattle are moving to market at lower average weights, maybe cattle that were not intended for market, at least not in that particular year. The red line up at the top is the total federally inspected beef cow slaughter. And it is higher both than recent years as well as the 5-year average. Now, beef exports, looking again at international markets, they are strong. In fact, they reached a new record in May. The quarters 2 through quarters 4 of 2022 are still forecasted. So these numbers aren't final, but in general, looking pretty good. But unfortunately, exports aren't currently a major influence in US markets, and they're even less so for Montana. So Montana cattle have several intermediate markets to move through before they or their meat can be sold overseas. So we generally produce calves, which get shipped east of here to the Midwest to get fattened up and then slaughtered. So we're a little bit buffered from what is happening in end markets. But in those end markets, we're not exporting a lot of beef as a country. So in contrast to what's going on with wheat markets, this is the same graph for a little bit longer time, and just more data that I was looking at. But the beef exports are the tiny bar in green in comparison to the total beef production, which is the tall bar in red. And so beef exports as a percent of production have been increasing over time, but right now they're just over 10%. And this is another USDA Economic Research Service publication. So how are people feeling overall about this? One resource I like to check a lot because it gives a good pulse on kind of what's happening in the overall ag economy and how people are feeling is the Ag Economy Barometer, which is put together by Purdue University and CME. And this barometer over the last few months has been looking pretty low. So 100 is kind of the baseline, and then in the last couple months, it has read below 100, which it hasn't really for quite some time. So what's happening? Well, producers are reporting that they are more concerned about rising costs, uncertainty about the future, concern about the supply chain, and then some interesting things happening in farmland values. So we've seen those really increase over the last couple of years, along with a lot of other types of real estate. That is kind of leveling off. So we're not worried about a decline in farmland prices at this point, but farmers are expecting that they'll stay relatively constant, so a slowing of growth. And people are expecting rental rate increases along with all of the other input cost increases that people are dealing with. So looking at production conditions, here's where we are at right now in comparison to a year ago. I found this map really interesting when I pulled it up the other day. Hadn't seen this pattern emerge yet. But right now, the majority of the state is looking okay, with an exception for kind of the Golden Triangle area, which is looking pretty droughty. And that is sort of a mirror image of where we were at 1 year ago, where that was the one portion of the state that was experiencing relatively less drought. If we look at the country as a whole, drought has become less intense, so less of the darkest red, most severe drought category, but it's kind of spread out quite a bit. So more areas covered in the South, in particular Texas, which is dealing with a lot of issues right now, and milder drought is sort of spread out kind of all the way over to the east as well. This is from the US Drought Monitor. these are published once a week, and it's an interesting way to look at kind of where Montana is at as a whole, and then compare that to the rest of the country. Think about markets that we are in competition with or reliant on. So the Midwest for grain crops, and then the Midwest again, but also to a lesser extent, Texas and other big cattle states. Looking forward, the outlook for precip is kind of where it's been for a while. Projected lower probability of average precipitation for the lower or the more southern part of the state, and higher probability of higher temperatures for, again, kind of the southern part of the state. And these are the August, September, and October forecasts from NOAA, and you can look them up more recently at the URL at the bottom of the screen. So with that, I'll wrap up. You can feel free to get in touch with me and let me know how your ag year is going.